They told us this plant disappeared because it was inefficient, outdated, and inferior to modern crops. But that explanation collapses the moment you look closer, because this plant didn't fail. It was removed. And not because it couldn't feed people, but because it fed them too well, too independently, and without permission. And today, inside Lost Nature Vault, you're going to see why this forgotten plant was quietly pushed out of our diets, how it once sustained entire civilizations, and why bringing it back would threaten the modern food system in ways most people never question. Before supermarkets, before supply chains, before fertilizer factories and patented seeds, humans relied on plants that were resilient, nutrient-dense, and impossible to fully control. And this plant was one of the most powerful among them, growing in poor soil, surviving drought, resisting pests, and providing more usable nutrition per acre than wheat ever could. Yet despite these advantages, it vanished from mainstream agriculture, not suddenly, not violently, but quietly, through policy, economics, and silence. At first glance, its disappearance seems accidental, a victim of progress, but progress is rarely neutral, and when we trace the timeline, we see a pattern repeating again and again across history. Foods that create independence are replaced by foods that create dependence. This plant didn't need chemical fertilizer, didn't require centralized processing, and didn't depend on global distribution networks, which meant communities could grow, harvest, store, and eat it without buying anything. And that single fact made it dangerous. Wheat, by contrast, looks harmless, but it demands plowing, fertilizers, irrigation, milling, transportation, and storage infrastructure. And that complexity creates control points, places where profit, power, and regulation can insert themselves. And once those systems exist, anything that bypasses them becomes a threat, not because it's unhealthy, but because it's uncontrollable. What makes this story uncomfortable is that no one ever officially banned this plant. Instead, it was excluded from research funding, removed from agricultural education, ignored by food subsidies, and quietly labeled primitive. And when a food stops being taught, stops being sold, and stops being planted, it disappears within a generation, not because people rejected it, but because they were never given the option. Ancient records tell us this plant was cultivated across multiple continents, from dry highlands to flood-prone valleys, valued not just for calories, but for resilience, because in times of famine, drought, or war, it kept producing when other crops failed, and this reliability made it central to survival, not luxury. Nutritionally, it offered a balance modern diets struggle to achieve: complex carbohydrates that release energy slowly, protein levels higher than wheat, essential minerals preserved because it wasn't stripped and refined, and natural compounds that reduced inflammation and stabilized blood sugar. But nutrition alone doesn't decide history. Power does. And when centralized states and empires began forming, they favored crops that could be taxed, stored, and controlled. And wheat fit that role perfectly. Unlike this forgotten plant, wheat depends on large, coordinated systems, which meant whoever controlled the system controlled the people. And over time, that advantage outweighed nutrition, resilience, and independence. The shift wasn't immediate. For centuries, both crops coexisted. But as governments standardized food supplies and markets expanded, policies quietly favored wheat, encouraging monocultures and discouraging diversity. And once farmers were locked into these systems, returning to independent crops became economically impossible. Here's the twist most people miss. This wasn't just about profit, it was about predictability. Because centralized power prefers fragile systems, it can manage over resilient systems it can't. And this plant was too adaptable, too forgiving, too free. Even today, traces of it survive on the margins, grown by indigenous communities, foraged in wild spaces, dismissed as a weed, but those who still use it know its value. Because when modern supply chains fail, when prices spike, when shelves empty, this plant remains growing quietly, ignored but dependable. Studies that do exist show it requires less water than wheat, tolerates poorer soil, and produces comparable or higher yields in harsh conditions. Yet funding for further research remains minimal. Because there is no incentive to revive a crop that can be easily monetized or patented. This brings us to the uncomfortable realization that modern food abundance is not designed around nourishment, but around control and profit And anything that disrupts that balance is pushed aside, not through force, but through neglect. If this plant were reintroduced at scale, it would empower small farmers, reduce dependency on chemical inputs, and decentralize food production. And that is precisely why it remains absent from mainstream agriculture. Think about how often history repeats this pattern. Resilient systems replaced by profitable ones. Independence, traded for efficiency, diversity, sacrificed for uniformity. And once that trade is complete, the old knowledge is labeled obsolete, not because it was wrong, but because it no longer serves those in power. Lost Nature Vault exists to uncover these buried truths, not to romanticize the past, but to understand what we lost and why. Because forgotten doesn't mean useless, and erased doesn't mean inferior. The real danger of this story isn't that one plant disappeared. It is that we've been trained not to notice when options are quietly removed from our lives, disguised as progress, convenience, or modernization. Ask yourself this. If a food is more resilient, more nutritious, and easier to grow, why would it vanish? While weaker alternatives dominate, and if the answer makes you uncomfortable, that's because it challenges the assumption that modern systems exist solely to serve us. This plant didn't vanish because people stopped eating it. People stopped eating it because systems stopped supporting it, and systems don't make neutral choices. The moment food becomes centralized, it becomes political. And when food becomes political, independence becomes a liability. That's the lesson buried inside this forgotten crop, and it's why its story matters now more than ever. Because climate instability, soil degradation, and fragile supply chains are exposing the weaknesses of the very systems that replaced it. As conditions worsen, the traits that once made this plant undesirable, decentralized power, resilience, adaptability, autonomy, are becoming exactly what humanity needs again. And that creates a tension no one wants to talk about. Because restoring forgotten crops means questioning the foundations of modern agriculture itself. This isn't about nostalgia or rejecting progress. It's about recognizing that progress without resilience is just delayed collapse. And that true food security comes from diversity, not dependence. Somewhere between ancient wisdom and modern control, we lost sight of what food was meant to do. Sustain life reliably, not generate endless profit. And until we confront that truth, and others like it will remain in the shadows, quietly waiting, growing where they're allowed, feeding those who remember, and reminding us that what was erased can always return. And here is the final question Lost Nature Vault leaves you with. If a single forgotten plant could challenge the modern food system simply by existing, what other truths have been buried alongside it, and what happens when people start digging again?